I'm delighted to welcome you all to our town hall today with the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Justin Trudeau. And we're gathering here today on the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. Advancing reconciliation is really important at Generation Squeeze, and indeed in our life, our focus on generational fairness is really central to the project of trying to implement in Canadian society the seventh generation principle. The wisdom and practice of governments for many Indigenous nations in Turtle Island to think about decisions today, not only for the present, but also what will it mean as far out as 7 generations from now. That's hard to do in Canadian politics when our electoral cycles are 4 to 5 years. And so our efforts try and enshrine generational fairness more into the machinery of government as a way to try and bring that Indigenous principle into the structures of our governance for the benefit of all. We're here to talk about fairness for every generation. That's the title of Budget 2024. It's also the call to action that Generation Squeeze has been making for over a decade since our inception. And so we think this budget is absolutely historic. Never before has a government acknowledged that the middle class right now is being really distorted by the way that one's age interacts with the housing system, how it shapes our experience in the housing system, so that income now matters less than it did in the past, and secure housing and home equity matter so much more, privileging people like me who've been in the housing market for some decades, especially in this region in Metro Vancouver. As many of you took your seats today, you would have seen scrolling on what is all too tiny a screen, a range of thank yous from the many, many people in our alliance, the over 40,000 folks who are part of Gen Squeeze, and many sent thank you notes to the Government of Canada for making the promise to restore fairness for every generation. And I wanted to highlight what's happening with the federal budget is being noticed around the world. The UK with the Intergenerational Foundation, they have described Canada's 2024 budget as a, quote, massive win for the principle of intergenerational fairness. In the US, the Berkeley Institute for Young Americans has identified it as historic. And both of those organizations are calling on governments around the world to take note of the leadership on generational fairness that is happening right now here in Canada. So with that, Prime Minister, I wanted to say congratulations. Thank you for that budget. Thank you for that progress. And can I invite you to greet the audience?
Well, listen, I want to thank all of you. You are here because Paul has immense admiration for you, for the work you do. I know it's a great group of people where we agree on all sorts of things and look forward to digging into the places where we can all learn from each other. It's interesting because you talked about the Indigenous principle of 7 generations as a way of building in a reflection that is more long-term. When I got into politics, it was very much from having been a teacher and a youth advocate and activist for years before I got into politics. And that frame was something I didn't go explicitly from the Indigenous side, although I knew that 7 generation principle. Like I realized that politics needed to bring in young people in a way that it hadn't before. Not just because, well, young people are often disconnected from politics, not because they're apathetic, but because they care so much. They see a more aggressive type of activism as being more impactful, a better use of their time than the kind of incrementalism that politics usually, and that governance usually brings. But the biggest reason that I used to lean on young people so much is because young people are naturally both more comfortable with change and more naturally long-term thinkers. When adults reach a certain point in their life, they think of the long-term as a linear extension of whatever moment they're in right now. If you set aside a certain percentage of your income, if you pay off the mortgage in a while, if you go through your career path in a certain way, that you can predict what your retirement's going to look like. Young people are leaping from living at home to high school to university to living out on their own to starting a family. Everything is such deeply transformational that it's easier to draw on young people for a longer term thinking than the 4-year political cycle usually allows to. So for me, leaning on young people and bringing them in 2015 was a hugely important part of what shaped my entry into politics. And the irony is now 10 years later, I look at those young people who got involved with me the first time. They're now in their late 20s and they're saying, I can't afford a home. Like, I thought you were supposed to be fixing this, and instead the world has gone in the wrong direction. And you can say, look, it would have been way worse had we not made the investments we did. But that's really the thing that fed into me to the need in this budget to say, okay, there's something fundamentally shifted in our economy that young people don't have the kinds of opportunities they had before, and that's what we're trying to go at, and that's where you and folks like you have been so incredibly helpful in our thinking.
Thank you. Well, I like your focus on younger folks already being mindful of the challenges and also the longer-term thinkers. And so I want to take that as a starting point and start our conversation reflecting on a video that you put out when you announced that the budget was going to focus on fairness for every generation. You were sitting in front of your office in an outfit much like today's, and the first couple of minutes of that video outlined for people a range of challenges that young folks were facing. But you were very intentional towards the end of the video, where you started to acknowledge older people, and you said to Gen Xers like me, full disclosure, that's like me too, and those who came before. And you said, younger folks are counting on us, and that we feel it in our bones. We can't let them down. I loved that moment. I loved that moment because I'm motivated by intergenerational solidarity. And if we actually are going to live up to that principle, we need young and old alike to come together. And I like that moment also because polling for some time now has showcased that a younger demographic worries that we don't necessarily have that solidarity as much. And indeed, Léger came out with polling just yesterday that said, identified over half of 18 to 29-year-olds that they can be convinced by a pollster to say previous generations are rigging the system for their benefit and making it harder for my generation. Now, clearly, none of us want younger folks feeling that way. So I wonder, taking your video, the end of your video as the starting point, what do we need to say to Gen X, to boomers, and those who came from, so that we don't let younger folks down?
Well, I think the first piece of it is, I think of all the conversations I've had with older generations of folks who are deeply committed to the environment, right? Even though, what happens beyond 10, 20 years from now will have zero impact on them, they know how important it is, whether it's the raging grannies, whether it's these really, really thoughtful folks who are thinking about legacy, thinking about the things that they were able to grow up with that they took for granted and that their grandkids may not see. So on the environment, I see it all the time. On childcare, I see it all the time. Grandparents who come up to say, oh my God, $10 a day childcare, making a huge difference in the 7 jurisdictions across the country where it's landed, just the cut in half made a huge difference. There are lots of older generations of folks who are thinking about it. The place where I think there's still work, because it doesn't feel intuitively like there's a solution, is around housing. You talk to an older generation of folks, they say, oh no, I remember I had to scrimp and save for years before we could set a down payment on a home. It was really hard, it was a big expense. Housing's always hard. It's not like, grandparents, loaf of bread used to cost me a nickel or whatever it is. It's this idea that, oh no, housing was always the big expense and it was always hard to get into housing. So they see young people saying, oh, it's hard to get into housing. I'm like, yeah, no, we lived that. And to explain to them, no, you didn't. There is something foundationally different in this generation that young people have great jobs and a solid side hustle and shifted expectations, and they still can't find a place to actually start on that path towards home equity or home ownership. That shift is different. And part of it's the underinvestment in housing construction over decades. But there's other things happening, and getting seniors to understand that there is something different, I think is a bit of a challenge that we're still working on.
Well, that's a perfect segue for me, because I'd love to push the conversation a bit deeper on that issue. Not that long ago, you had a really fascinating interview with a Gen Z reporter running a podcast for the Globe. And it's been called City Space, highly recommend it, folks. And it was a really clever reporter. She effectively said, Prime Minister, for my generation, it would be so helpful if housing prices fell. But clearly for homeowners right now, that's not what they're going to think is in their interest. And so she asked, like, how do you manage that tension? And if you'll permit me, I'll paraphrase. It was an important moment because I was impressed you didn't dodge the question. You instantly, as any good politician would do in a country where the majority of voters are homeowners, said, we need to have housing retain its value because that's how we protect the nest eggs of those who are older. But in the very same breath, you didn't even take a breath in between, you acknowledge that for those who are renting, those who are going to locked out of homeownership, that the resulting wealth inequalities, that's not always fair. And I liked that interview because I think it showcases how big an ask that Gen X, boomers, and those who came before are making of a younger demographic. Yeah. Effectively, the political compromise for some time now has been, younger folks, can you tolerate higher rents, longer periods of time of putting off that dream of homeownership if it can come to fruition at all in some of our cities? Can you sacrifice in those ways, in no small part to protect the home equity of those who came before? And so how do we, as Gen Xers and those old, how do we talk to an older demographic and say, wow, let us recognize how much we're asking for younger folks? And are there ways for us to reciprocate more, including in the world of politics, to help deliver more of the policy adaptations that can help make hard work pay off for younger folks the way that it did some decades ago?
One of the stats that fascinated me is, there are countries in which home ownership levels are much lower, where people don't put all their retirement eggs into the home equity basket, right? I mean, like the idea that you would have, you'd buy a home, you'd pay off the mortgage, and then you'd watch the value of it skyrocket, and that would be your pension.
That's my story, by the way.
Well, bully for you. I now live in, yeah.
No, you can have me on the hot seat.
No,
this is
I know,
the reality.
this is it. And we've taken those last, 10, 20 years of massive increase in value of homes as sort of a new normal, as, okay, this is the way the system works, and it's tough, but it means that we're gonna have value in our homes that we can therefore retire on. And I tend to think that if we were a country that did a better job in helping people plan for retirement, in better pensions, so there wouldn't be that massive gap in terms of people who rent, throughout their lives. Like, there are lots of cities around the world where people just accept that they're going to rent their entire lives, but they're not feeling they're going to be impoverished in retirement. Well, other people who rent in Canada feel like they have a big piece of a nest egg that's simply not there because they've been renters all their lives. There's a challenge there that I think there are elements of policy solutions, but the big thing is we just have to slow down on the speculation, right? I mean, like housing prices and value should increase over a lifetime, but you shouldn't be able to flip a home, 8 years later and have it double the price, right? I mean, there's something unsustainable, and it moves housing into an investment vehicle rather than a vehicle for supporting a family and building a community around it. And as soon as it's an investment vehicle, you have people who have money using it as a way of generating more, as opposed to saying, okay, everyone should have an opportunity to do this.
So at Gen Squeeze, when we talk about that theme, we refer to housing should be for homes first and investment second. Of
course.
And it's quite a cultural shift in Canada, though, for us to actually think that we don't want home prices to rise really any longer. In fact, for the next many, many years, it would be great if they minimally stalled so that people's earnings would have a chance to catch up. But that is a mental shift. That's a mental model shift, and it requires asking an older demographic to come on board with that. Now, I think you were the first senior politician that I'm aware of to actually say out loud when asked by a media person, hey, what do you want to have to happen to home prices? And you said, we don't want them to go up any longer. I'm working hard to have premiums.
Not going up at the same speculative, unsustainable rate that they have been. I mean,
I might even push just in the short term, just like not go up anymore whatsoever, actually.
I'm trying to solve for that by building massive levels of supply, and hopefully that will have a bit of an impact there.
So as we have a convergence more and more that we don't want to see the same rate of escalation of home prices, and people like me and groups like gensqueeze will say, let's just stall more generally, that'd be an interesting place for ongoing conversation. That is part of the reciprocity, though, that an older demographic could show. Like, hey, we understand that. And in many respects, it doesn't really ask that much of them in terms of their adaptations. It's actually asking more of a younger demographic. We're asking you to figure out how to better plan for retirement down the road when you can't count on home prices driving your security later on. So in fact, it's another adaptation that we're expecting of younger demographic, and I think we should be open to acknowledging that. I'm gonna put up a slide that I really do hope your team briefed you on in advance. We did share it. I go every year to the budget lockup, and there's a table, A16, in the budget that every year I madly crunch the numbers into an Excel document, and I send it to my lovely team member, Megan, who right now can't put up her hand because she's filming, to help make it into an infographic. I bring this up because as we're asking a younger demographic to make a lot of adaptations in the housing system to...
I'm just hooked on your choice of animals.
Okay, yes, right, I need to showcase.
There's a T-Rex and a beaver there on the same...
There's a T, and Megan will make the case that the T-Rex is absolutely part of the Canadian animal lexicon, given if you were to like travel to, to travel to Alberta and go see some of the great fossils. So I should just, for people listening later on.
Elephants are a part of the
elephants
Canadian?
are not. The elephant is the elephant in the room.
Ah, there we go.
And
okay,
the elephant in the room is that...
I've known Paul long enough to know he has an answer for everything. I shouldn't have even tried.
The elephant is trying to bring that cliche out, the elephant in the room, that I've done so much media saying that the current federal housing plan is the most comprehensive we've seen nationally in decades. I have been on the record many, many times saying that the $10 a day childcare system is something that was first recommended 50 years ago and half a century of governments did not act on. And yet I also have to go and do media and say that notwithstanding how historic childcare is right now and the new investments for housing, they are quite modest in comparison by the new spending growing on something like old age security. The magnitude of order of old age security increasing 10 times faster than childcare, 15 times faster than new money for housing. And when I see this, this kind of depiction of what's happening in budgets, it's hard to see this as the intergenerational reciprocity from an older demographic towards younger. Hey folks, you're struggling in the housing system. How can we bring other costs of living down for you? This looks like it's actually also asking a younger demographic, in addition to sacrificing somewhat in the housing system, we're also asking you to tolerate more government spending going to the parents and grandparents you love, but relatively less coming to you. I don't think most older people know this. I know we have at Gen Squeeze many people, we call them grandambassadors, who are deeply concerned about the legacy they're leaving for their kids and grandchildren, but are not entirely aware of this age gap in spending. So I wonder, how does a group like Generation Squeeze, how do you as a leader of the federal government, how do we help an older demographic come to recognize that this is the pattern that's been building over decades in our budgets and ask for their help to help find a better balance between young and old alike?
Well, I think part of it is the solutions that we're actually going to put forward tangibly. Because if you just look at a pictogram like that, you're going to say, okay, you're going to have to, chop those elephants' legs off, or you're going to have to, massively reduce some of the
or make a very big beaver.
Maybe a very yeah. What we actually have to think about as well is what are those things that can change actually the reality on the ground in a way that doesn't project. I mean, like you said, if young people have other ways and actually realize, okay, they're not going to get the same kind of home buyers plan necessarily that people a generation ago did in terms of what their retirement nest egg will be, those are things that we can look at to try and make sure they happen. I mean, one of the things that always comes up for me is the idea that, on housing, you have a whole bunch of older folks who are living in houses that are too much house for them right now, but their connection to neighborhood, to community means that no, they don't want to move out to the suburbs or to some different city to be closer to their grandkids. They want to still live in their community's quality of life, and there is no housing that they can afford even to downsize other than staying in their big house. So where you're actually working to increase the amount of apartments or senior assisted living centers in neighborhoods where people currently live in single family homes, that's a piece that you can actually, I don't know that goes directly at the animals challenge here, but it does start to look at the kinds of things that give you a way out that will eventually shift those numbers in a meaningful way. Drastic changes in budgeting projections are very, very difficult. I mean, when we came in with childcare, when we came in with dental care, which is from kids all the way up to seniors, when we move at pharmacare on prescription contraceptives and insulin, none of those specifically seniors facing, but all of them mattering across generations. These are things that we got an awful lot of pushback on, and it's a shame to see the largest housing investment in Canada's history is that a mouse or a mole? Or
it's a mole. A mouse would have been rude.
There we go.
It's a mole.
It's a mole. These are things that we're facing as much pushback as I think we could have borne.
I think one of the challenges in Canada today is that many a citizen, many a voter doesn't recognize that whether we're talking about you in Ottawa or Premier Eby here in BC or Premier Ford in Ontario, notice my nonpartisanship there, everybody.
3 parties, very good.
All of them are running deficits right now outside of recession. And in many respects, the research would show that exists now because several decades ago, our governments recognized that as baby boomers go from younger folks into retirement, the ratio of workers to retirees was going to transform. So when boomers started out, there were 7 working age people for every retiree. Now as boomers retire, there's only 3 workers for every retiree. And we can understand why our older loved ones have every reason to want the same, if not better, benefits. But the ability to pay for that is not nearly as straightforward as it was some decades ago. In the mid-90s, the federal government actually identified that problem, and they changed our Canada Pension Plan and said, hey, boomers, well, you're still working. We need to collect more revenue from you right now. And that's one of the reasons why the CPP is identified around the world as one of the best pension plans available. There was a plan to replace old age security. It was going to be a new seniors benefit. It was in the budget in 96, 97, and 98, and then poof, kind of evaporated by 99. And at the time, they brought premiers together to talk about the challenges to plan for an aging population down the road. And premiers participated, but didn't adjust how they would raise revenue for medical care. So those are the big challenges. Those are the big things that are growing in the budget right now. But you're having to pick up the bag from poor planning past decades ago. How do we ask an older demographic to say, hey, how do young and older lean into providing political cover for people like you to make some adaptations?
Well, I mean, one of the adaptations we made early on, 6 months in after we got elected in 2015, was we changed the Canada Pension Plan in a significant way that didn't make any difference right now, but will absolutely make a difference in the kind of pensions available to a young person now who retires 30 years from now. Those were shifts that we knew needed to happen. It was actually Bill Morneau who really drove this forward, and there was a lot of pushback. Actually, Hassan Youssef and the Canadian Labour Congress were the ones who were really driving this, and we got it done within 6, no fanfare, nobody paid much attention to it. Conservatives still attack us because we were raising payroll taxes, according to them, to secure generations' future. But I mean, that challenge of doing things that are structural changes that set that path towards fairness, anytime you're doing something with a long-term bent in politics, people say, and I remember in opposition doing the same thing, I say, oh yeah, no, and Mr. Harper just announced this change. Well, he'll be in his 11th mandate when this actually makes a difference, and we all sort of have a chuckle. And now I'm in government and saying, okay, that kind of thinking of actually setting things up so that so that there's a long tail and actual shift matters. But in order to do that, we have to have, as a society, a much more sophisticated political conversation about what's going on in our finances than I think the current tendencies are, whether it's around what social media is feeding to us, whether it's the clickbait necessity of the right bumper stickers and TikTok videos to get a message across, to try and amplify fear or anger or frustration rather than try to solve for it. Like, we're in a very, very difficult time to try and have reasonable conversations about responsible, earnest things to do that are going to leave the country and the world in a better place.
Well, you're in a room full of people who I think would like to support you in that endeavor, to find more of that nuance and that, and rather than just the bumper sticker in the conversation. So let's talk about how we can do that more. Yeah, I will draw attention to léger pooling again, though. That would, oh, I can't. Why can I not move forward? How discouraging. Oh, there we are. How nice. A graphic like the one I just showed does help to better understand why a younger demographic is worried more and more and becoming cynical about politics more and more, that the momentum that governments have is more oriented towards the later in the life course than earlier on. And I take very seriously your observation about the Canada Pension Plan. Done in 2016, that adaptation's a big deal. And for the Millennials and Gen Zs in the room, when they come to retirement, that will be the change that was made will be integral to them having lower levels of poverty. There's no doubt about it. But again, notice it was an adaptation largely asked of a younger demographic. And so I think that the big challenge for us going forward is, how do we ask our parents and our grandparents to lean into a political conversation that says, we want to protect you in your retirement and we want you to leave the legacy you want for your kids and grandchildren?
That's part of the challenge. That's what a good example is the fight we're currently having over the capital gains inclusion rate. Right, we know that unlocking close to $20 billion to be able to invest in housing opportunities, to be able to put towards the things that young people are going to need now, by asking not older generations specifically, but those who've done very well, particularly amongst older generations, to not to pay a little more, just to make a little less profit when they sell off extremely profitable investments. And the political debate around that has, is got some very, very loud voices on the headwind side on this, and it's there's mixed up with a lot of cynicism. It's mixed up with a lot of disinformation. But fundamentally, the calculation we made is, no, if we're going to talk about fairness for every generation, we're going to actually have to try and rebalance things at least a little bit.
Yeah, so you're thinking about the rebalancing side on the revenue side, rebalancing in terms of okay, that I would love to dig into that more, but I need to be disciplined and make sure I hand over the microphone to others in the room. So let me wrap up my part of the conversation with you this way. In the fall, the United Nations is going to be having a Summit of the Future. It's the first of its kind where the UN will focus on generational fairness. And I've already identified that the international community is identifying the most recent federal budget as leadership. And I think there's opportunities for us in Canada to lead still further by taking a cue from a country like Wales, where they've enshrined into legislation an act to promote generational fairness. And so that has people at Gen Squeeze wondering, as we head towards the next fall economic statement, might there be room to initiate an act to safeguard the well-being of present and future generations? One that would appoint a minister to have responsibility for that issue, for generational fairness, an advisory body to guide us to get to that better place, and then somebody like a commissioner in the Auditor General's office to monitor and report annually. Is that something that doable in the months ahead?
I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think it's something that you and I can probably work together on.
All right. Well, that's a great way to end our part of the conversation. I think in Canadian politics, regardless of our political affiliations, we've kind of lost the habit of saying thank you to our elected representatives. So I want to say a broader thank you, and I thought I could do so, not in my words, but in the words of another Gen Squeeze member. Her name's Verena. And recently, she and her husband moved to the Bay Area of California because he was recruited for a great tech job, which means they make good money and they're in where everybody wants to go to be at the heart of innovation. And recently she's reached out to share that they've decided to come home. And they've decided to come home because Canada feels safe, not just because of crime, but the way that she describes safety is that it's a place where, as we're raising our family, there is going to be $10 a day childcare, which is a game changer in their thinking financially. And there are child benefits on which they can count. And if they want another baby, we actually have a parental leave system. And if they want to take their kids to the medical care system, they don't have to think about the week's worth of revenue that they needed to find to pay for the visit. And when I, as a public policy scholar, look at each of those issues, I can say the following. Under your tenure, we have done something historic with childcare that's never happened before. We have improved the Canada Child Benefits, which absolutely have reduced childhood poverty by ways I'd never seen earlier in my professional career. On your watch, the number of doctors per capita has gone up quite dramatically, notwithstanding some of the challenges to access physicians. In large part because we haven't done enough to reduce the line of patients, I would argue. But these are all things that have happened under your watch. And so for the Verinas of the country, and the Verinas even not in the country, planning to come back, I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You know, I so many times as a young person, when I was getting into politics, I would, you know, the way I would deal with youth issues is I would think back to how things were when I was a kid, and that along the way suddenly shifted. And I'm here with my son Hadrian, who's 10, and if I don't take one of the 3 kids with me every now and then, I don't see them that much. So I now realize that a lot of what I'm doing when I think about what I'm bringing in as policies is, instead of thinking back to how things were when I was a kid, I project forward into what the world they're going to be living in, and that keeps me grounded. And the question in politics is always, okay, is it worth it? Is the time I'm spending away from my family worth it because I'm doing enough to build enough of a better world to make up for the missed story time or the missed bedtimes that I'm on the road for? And you never get a clear answer to that, but just asking the question of saying, okay, am I doing this to score points or to win, or am I doing this to actually make things better for the largest number of people? And that's one of the things that helps me stay with this job, no matter how challenging it is.
Well, thank you to you and to Hadrian. It is a big sacrifice to let your dad be on the road serving the rest of us. And on the note of thanks, let me say, well, thanks to your team. Just to spend 1 hour with us requires an incredible amount of effort from so many people on your team. And so I just want to say a thank you to all of them. I want to say thank you to UBC Robson Square, who has been wonderful both today and last week when we hosted the Deputy Prime Minister. You have gone beyond the call of duty to be a wonderful host with us. The President's Office at the University of BC has really made it possible for us to take advantage of the great venue here. My talented, small but mighty little Gen Squeeze team has gone well beyond the call of duty to make the last 2 events come together. And then to the audience, you've really deeply shaped the conversation this week and last. And I'm really indebted to that. And may we go forward in pursuit of being good ancestors, and I think heed the message that in order for the world of policy and politics to legislate as good ancestors, we need to work harder and harder to provide enough political cover. So that will be our mission.
The Indigenous 7 generations saying is one of the ones I've always liked as much, is that we don't inherit the world from our parents, we borrow it from our grandchildren.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Always a pleasure. Thank you.